this is the Flying Logic Quick Start video. I'm going to show you how to get started creating Flying Logic documents from scratch. So for this example, I'm going to construct what's called a transition tree. This is a tree that you use to work backwards from a goal to a set of actions that would achieve the goal. It's one of the tools in the theory of constraints thinking processes, but there are several, and they all kind of work together harmoniously. You wouldn't necessarily start a project by doing a transition tree, but it's very approachable. I'm going to deliberately choose to use a toy problem for this example because I'm not trying to show you how to solve every problem here. I'm actually trying to show you how to use the application specifically. On our left-hand side, the sidebar here contains several inspectors, and these little tabs open and close these inspectors. There's a document inspector, the domain inspector, which is the one we care about the most in this one, the navigation inspector, which lets you move quickly around your document. So these are all available. You can hide the whole thing if you want to present, but for now, when you're building, you want to have the inspectors that you're most likely to use open. And then within the domain inspector, we have these they're marked with a green D. These are domains, and these are for solving different kinds of problems. The one we're going to focus on here is called effects-based planning. As you can see, we have goals, intermediate effects, preconditions, actions, undesirable effects, and desirable effects. And I'll be explaining more about what these mean as we go forward. To start our document, we're going to create some entities within our document. Entities are these rounded corner rectangles that represent concepts. And we're going to start with a goal. And to create a goal entity, we're just going to drag from the goal domain into the document, and there it appears. Now you notice I dragged and dropped it, but where you drop it really isn't necessarily what appears. If I drag it over here, it's not going to necessarily appear where I dropped it. It appears where Flying Logic wants it to be. And that's one of the first things you learn about Flying Logic is it is handling the layout and formatting details. It's not a typical drawing program. It doesn't let you put anything anywhere. That's not the focus of Flying Logic. The focus of Flying Logic is to let you focus on what the diagram means and let it figure out how to lay it out. Once you make that leap, Flying Logic becomes your partner in creating these kinds of diagrams. So let me get rid of that extra goal here. And if we have a goal, and like I say, I'm going to use a toy problem here, and my favorite toy problem is making a cup of tea. So let's make our goal, I have a hot cup of tea. In a transition tree, we start with a goal, and then we take inventory of the preconditions. Preconditions are things that help us work towards our goal, but they pre-exist. They pre-exist in the scenario we're describing. I can create a precondition the same way I created the goal, just by dragging it there. I'm going to undo now. Or I can create an entity by double-clicking it. Or I can create entities by dragging them and connecting them to existing entities using these drop zones. And we'll talk about more of those in a little bit. Right now, I actually want to brainstorm a little bit. I'm going to delete that one. And I want to just quickly create some preconditions, things I know to be true at the start of my scenario. And for that, I'm going to go down to this little italicized green icon right now. It says quick capture. I have a whole nother video about quick capture, but I'm going to use that right now to quickly create some preconditions. Notice that I have preconditions selected over here. So it's going to, the entities I create are going to be unconnected preconditions. If I wanted them to be connected, I'd click there. I'm going to leave that off right now. And I'm just going to type some things that, would be typically true. Like, for example, I have a source of water. And I press return, and the entity appears. I have a pot. I have a stove. I have a cup. And I have the all-important tea bag. Okay, so I have these disconnected entities, and I want to arrange these in a sequence that helps me achieve my goal. These are the preconditions. The thing that you need to have with your preconditions are the actions you're going to take, because preconditions, as I said, pre-exist. Actions are what you do. So I'm going to say I'm done with the quick create, and I'm going to imagine an action that would lead to my goal. So let's actually create the action here, and let's drop it to the left of my goal. And because my document is laid out left to right, and you see I have the orientation here, I can lay out any way I want. Default is left to right. That means that when I dropped it to the left, the action became a predecessor of the goal. What would the action be that leads to my goal? So I'm working backwards from the goals here. So let's see, I steep a tea bag in a cup of water. Okay, so there's an action that leads to the goal. But the thing about actions is you can't take an action until the preconditions that need to go along with it have been met. You're always pairing up actions with preconditions when you do a transition tree. So for example, I steep a tea bag in a cup of water presumes I have a tea bag. Well, that means this precondition has to be true. So I'm going to drag from this precondition to the arrow that connects the action to the goal. And what that does is it creates a junctor, which is a junction operator, in this case, and. And that means that both this action and this precondition are necessary and sufficient to create the goal. When you set up the document the way by default, it basically means that if one thing is connected to another directly, it means that the predecessor is necessary and sufficient to achieve the goal. Well, in this case, the action by itself isn't possible without the precondition. You would also need the cup. And you would also have to have a source of water. Okay, so you notice I haven't used the pot or the stove yet. So something's not right with my document here, because if I did this, I would have cold, weak tea. But right now the document reads, I have a cup, I have a tea bag, I have a source of water. So I steep a tea bag in a cup of water and I have a hot cup of tea, which really isn't correct. What do I need to do? I have more steps to my process here. And the step that precedes the goal is called an intermediate effect. So I'm going to drag an intermediate effect to the line, and I'm going to hold it right off the line here, not right on it, but right just off it, and let go. And that inserts the intermediate effect into the arrow. And so what is this intermediate effect? Well, the intermediate effect in this case would be I have hot water. So how do I get my water hot? Well, I have to make hot water. And to do that, I have to use my stove and my pot. So let's presume that the stove, having the stove and having the pot, are necessary preconditions. Now notice that these arrows are all enter this directly. When you have several arrows entering an entity directly, the way this document is set up, which is using sufficient cause thinking, any of these are sufficient to cause this. This is an or relationship, and that's not correct. So I want to redirect this arrow to this arrow to create a new and juncture to say that these things are both required to have hot water. So I also want to move the I have a source of water over to this and juncture, because that's also a requirement to have hot water. So I'm going to hover over here, and so you can see it highlighting. See how as I move around here, you see the highlights for the arrows. I'm going to click on the bottom one, which as you can see is I have a source of water, and I'm going to move it up to the and juncture. Now notice that it didn't really move the precondition up, it actually moved the and juncture down, and that's Flying Logic's choice. If you want to kind of restrict that choice, because some people don't like the fact that Flying Logic, in its effort to minimize line crossings and keep the diagram simple, it will sometimes flip things around. So let me undo that and show you what another way around that, and that's to use the incremental layout. This little red icon here, if I turn that on, it'll tell Flying Logic to only minimally reorganize the diagram on each step. This is very useful at times for keeping your place in the diagram. So I'm going to do the exact same action this time. I'm going to drag up to here, and notice how this time it actually moved hardly anything. It just moved the arrow, but at the expense of creating several new line crossings here. And if I leave, the longer you leave incremental layout on, it will move things around very minimally, but things will start to become more and more tangled until you need to kind of let it rearrange things. So I'm going to turn that off there, let it rearrange things the way it wants. So use incremental layout judiciously, especially when you're working with larger diagrams. There are other tips for using larger diagrams like grouping and hoisting that we'll get into in other videos, but realize that incremental layout is an important thing in your toolbox. So I now have these three preconditions, but I don't yet have an action to go with them. So I'm going to drag an action here to the entry drop zone of the and juncture and drop it there, and that connects a new action in. And that's how you'll most often create entities in Flying Logic documents. You won't create them free floating and then connect them. You'll most often do a gesture that adds the entity to the document already pre-connected the way you like. When you have a newly created entity like this, if you press the tab key, you notice it just deselected the arrow. If I press it again, then it highlights the text. So you can press tab once or twice when you create a new entity and be ready to type into that entity. So this action is going to be, I turn on the fire and wait. And so again, to tell the story of the diagram, I have a pot, I have a stove, I have a source of water, I turn on the fire and wait. And is that enough detail? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. Some people say, how do you know how much detail is necessary? Well, that all really depends on what you're trying to model. You can talk about the problem of air. Should you say that the room has air in it? Should you say that there's gravity? Well, if you're talking about procedures on a space station for making tea, you might need to mention those things, that the space station needs to be rotating or something to make sure there's artificial gravity. The water has to be contained somehow in a way that, but if you're just working in a cabin or a kitchen or something like that on Earth, you don't need to worry about that. So it really depends on what you're doing. So always ask yourself, is this useful to what we're trying to analyze? In our case, we're going to add one more layer of intermediate effects, one more step that we're going to have to achieve. And we're going to do this by adding another intermediate effect right here on this line called, I have a pot filled with water. So we're going to create a new edge from our source of water here to the edge here, which creates a new and juncture. And then we're going to clean up this line. So that also is another way of moving a entity from wherever it's connected to a new place where it's connected. And again, preconditions always need to be paired with actions. So I'm going to add another action here. And we're going to call this one, I fill the pot with water. Okay, so let's tell ourselves a story now. I have a source of water, I have a pot. I fill the pot with water. Those things together are necessary and sufficient to have a pot filled with water. I have a stove. I turn on the fire and wait, and therefore I have hot water. Okay, so far so good. Now what about this? This isn't connected to the right place. This arrow really needs to be pointing here because it's only after we have hot water that we can make the tea. So I'm going to hover over here. You see the drag zone here. I'm going to just drag that over to this line here, and that moves it there and creates a new and juncture. So to read this, it's I have hot water, and I have a tea bag, and I have a cup, so I can steep a tea bag. Now these two and junctures here seem kind of redundant. So in a situation like this, you don't want to just delete this edge because it causes this whole thing to be unconnected, and the adjunctors without both an input and an output get cleaned up. So I'm going to do that. So what's a better way of rearranging this and not having this extra adjunctor here? Well, the way to do that is to move this arrow to this adjunctor. And notice that when I do that, now this adjunctor is correct. This adjunctor is extra. And so to get rid of that, all I have to do is move this arrow to the goal, and that adjunctor gets cleaned up automatically. Entities can float freely. Edges have to have a tail object and a head object, like in this case, an entity and a junctor. And junctors always have to have at least one input and one output. There's another video called The 4 Elements of Flung Logic, where I go into the relationship between entities, edges, junctors, and groups, which is the fourth element that we haven't talked about yet, but we'll get into that in a bit. So every time you go through a major transformation of your document, you want to read it to yourself and make sure it still makes sense. Read the preconditions first. I have a pot, I have a source of water. I fill the pot with water. This means I have a pot filled with water. I have a stove. So I turn on the fire and wait. I have hot water. I also have a tea bag and a cup. I steep a tea bag in the cup of water, and I have a hot cup of tea. Okay, so that's a transition tree. But one of the most beautiful things about these techniques is they don't stop there. They don't assume that everything is going to go off exactly as planned, and they ask you to imagine what would happen if not everything works out as planned. So for example, if I didn't have a stove, what would I do? Well, you could play out that scenario using Flung Logic pretty easily. Or you can also play out what happens that is a consequence of my actions. Second and third order consequences that you might not expect. Okay, so again, this is a toy example. We're not being serious here, but let's take a consequence that comes out of making a hot cup of tea. And let's just kind of drag this to the end here. And this is an undesirable effect called I have a used tea bag. Now, remember, these arrows mean is sufficient to cause. So is having a hot cup of tea sufficient to cause having a used tea bag? This is a causality reservation. And there's other places where I'll talk about those kinds of reservations. They're called the categories of legitimate reservation. But having a hot cup of tea by itself doesn't cause a used tea bag. Really, it's the act of steeping the tea bag in the cup of water that causes the tea bag to be used. So this really belongs somewhere else. It belongs as a consequence of steeping the tea bag. So this is a more accurate depiction of the causal relationships. So what do we do about this undesirable effect? And remember, real life scenarios have undesirable effects, and sometimes those undesirable effects have undesirable effects. And you want to really think about that when you create diagrams like this. So one way with dealing with undesirable effects is to imagine something else you can do to mitigate that undesirable effect. So for example, if I want to turn an undesirable effect or mitigate an undesirable effect such that the outcome ultimately is a desirable effect, I would have to again figure out what preconditions already exist and what actions I would have to take to do that. So let's model that. Let's put a precondition. Let's drag this right on here, which creates a junctor with it. And then let's pair that with an action. So here we've modeled our mitigation strategy in the abstract. We haven't defined what A, B, and C are yet. So to figure out what actions we should take, we need to take inventory of our preconditions. So for example, let's say we have a garden, and gardens often have compost piles. And so let's say I have a compost pile. So this would suggest an action of I throw the tea bag on the compost pile. And that yields the effect of I have more compost. So in this case, we've designed a strategy that reacts to the undesirable effect and produces a desirable effect. And it's important that when you do a transition tree, at the very end of your tree, you have nothing but goals and desirable effects. all your undesirable effects have to be addressed. And this is one way to address them, is you mitigate them. Now, there's another way of addressing an undesirable effect, and that's to come up with a different strategy that never even encounters the undesirable effect. And to do that, you have to figure out other actions that don't go through that path of creating that used tea bag of that undesirable effect. So how can we do that? Well, let's imagine another action that can achieve our goal. And again, we're going to be abstract for a minute here. We're going to say what action coupled with what precondition is going to achieve our goal that's a different way than we had previously. Well, for example, again, we look at our preconditions, and let's say there's iced tea in the fridge. So we've already made a pitcher of iced tea in the fridge. And let's say it turns out our kitchen also has a microwave oven. So this would suggest the action of I heat a cup of iced tea in the microwave. One of the interesting things about flying logic is you can connect things up most ways as long as there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So for example, having a cup, I say I heat a cup of iced tea in the microwave, that presumes the cup. I've used the cup in this part of the scenario. I can also use it down here just by dragging back to my adjunctor. Now it's used two places. It's used in the traditional tea making scenario, and it's used in my microwave scenario. So this way of making our cup of tea doesn't even go through this undesirable effect. It basically is a way of proactively mitigating the undesirable effect, as opposed to this, which is reactively mitigating. Now, I've just introduced these two categories. I have two strategies here. The fact that there's two arrows entering my goal, that's an OR relationship when the document is set up for sufficient cause reasoning. And that means the entity operator for the document is set up as OR. The entity operator is how these things are combined. So to show you that, I'm going to go up here to the toolbar and turn on the confidence spinners. And these confidence spinners are like little pie charts that represent states between all the way false, all the way true, or anywhere in between. And there's keyboard shortcuts like T for true, and F for false, and 5 for 50%, or 2 for 20%. You can easily use those anytime you like to set these real quickly. And these let you actually run your logic through the diagram. So for example, if it's true that I have a source of water and true that I have a pot, and then I fill the pot with water, watch what happens over here to the intermediate effect. I say T for true, and I have a pot filled with water becomes true. You can't directly manipulate the spinners on entities that have an input arrow in them. These are driven by the entities that don't have inputs. So these are the drivers, these are the driven. So these aren't manipulable. So always remember that entities with predecessors are driven by their input operators, in this case the AND. So all of these have to be true, this and this and this, for this to be true. So let's go to the next step. I have a stove. Let's make that true. That means that when the precondition and the intermediate effect are true, then I can take the action. That's how you should think about this in a transition tree. If the preconditions are true and the other intermediate effects are true, that's when this action becomes eligible to be taken. So I turn on the fire and wait, and I have hot water. So the next step would be I have a tea bag, and I have a cup. And here's where I can actually steep the tea bag in the cup of water. And you see my goal has become true. I haven't even had to deal with this side of things. Now, this is all a bit disorganized. You see how these are all kind of mixed together? Let's use groups to categorize things a little bit better. So I have two basic scenarios here. I have this scenario and this scenario. So what I'm going to do is select this and then come up here to the edit menu and say select predecessors. As you can see, it just selected all the predecessors of the arrow that I had selected. So now I'm going to group those. So when I group them, it placed them all inside this new group. Then I'm going to press Tab, and that lets me edit the title of the group. And I'm going to call this the microwave strategy. Now, my goal is part of two different strategies, so I don't want it to actually be inside the microwave strategy by itself. So I'm going to simply drag it out of that group, and then I'm going to highlight the predecessors of the other strategy. And that includes the I have a cup, which is also part of both strategies. So I'm going to take it out as well. And then I'm going to unhighlight the I have a cup and the edge that connects it and group everything else. And this I'm going to call the traditional strategy. So now I have my two strategies. And of course, these right here are actually part of that traditional strategy. So I'm going to simply select them. Notice I hold down the Alt key to select groups. Alt key, drag, select. And then just drag this down into my traditional group. And I'm going to move the goal again out of the traditional group because it doesn't really belong in either. And so all of this is my traditional strategy, and this is my microwave strategy. And so if I didn't want to present my microwave strategy at all, I could simply collapse it. Now, in terms of my traditional strategy here, I have the actual main strategy, the actions I'm going to take, and then I have the mitigation steps. And let's say I want to separately group them. So I have more compost, and the action, and the precondition, and the undesirable effect. Those are all part of my mitigation strategy. So I'm going to group those separately. And notice this creates a nested group. And I press Tab and type mitigation. And so if I'm presenting this to somebody else who's scrutinizing my document, I can have this collapsed at the start and point out how this is one of two strategies to achieve my goal, and it has an undesirable effect, which we've mitigated. And I can reveal that by showing that off there. If I don't like how much it jumps around, I can always try turning on incremental layout, ungroup it, and you'll see it actually doesn't move it around much at all. So that might be better for presentations, because incremental layout moves things around minimally, but the longer you leave it on, the more tangled things are going to get. You can even use layers of groups to reveal a plan progressively when you present it to other people. You can create a step 1 layer, and then you can create a step 2 layer, and then you can create a step 3 layer. Let's include the mitigation in that. And then if you collapse these, in fact, I'm going to hold down Option key and collapse my whole traditional, and that does a deep collapse. Then if I open this up, it just shows these 3 steps. And if I want, I can name this step 1, step 2, step 3. So if I want to present this, I can say, okay, step 1 is getting the pot filled with hot water. Step 2 is making the water hot. Step 3 is actually making the tea. And the mitigation step, if we need it, is already planned out. And that way, people who review your document can ask sensible questions as you go through your plan. So hopefully that will get you started with Flying Logic. It's a pretty deep piece of software. It's got a lot of features in it. I'm going to make a lot more videos about this, but this should get you started. We have a forum. You can ask questions in the forum. We have a Discord chat. You can ask questions there. If you have support questions, email support@FlyingLogic, and happy planning.